This is Gretchen Carlson of the Martial Journeys podcast, and you're listening to the Kung Fu podcast with T.W. Smith. Your skill in martial arts history has increased by 1.
Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. And I'm your host, T.W. Smith. If this is your first time to the program, welcome. You are in the audience of some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world. People that put in a great deal of sweat and a great deal of care to honing their craft. You may or may not be aware of what was called the Slave Bible. And it told of Joseph's enslavement, but it left out parts where Moses led the Israelites to freedom. Most of the Old Testament is missing, and only about half of the New Testament remains in that piece of work. Why all the extra censorship? Well, it was so that the enslaved Africans in the Caribbean islands of Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua couldn't read or be read anything that might incite them to rebel. Stories in the past can guide future direction. What is shared, omitted, and context all make a difference. So we're going to be looking into the second part of Alfred Lister's influence on modern martial arts. As we explained in the last podcast, Lister was a writer, translator. He was a legal presence in the late 1800s. And for a man who did not practice martial arts, and in most cases didn't really care about them per se as far as being involved in them, he greatly influenced them. Make sure to go back to listen to the Lost Kung Fu Manual. Those who have or want power and influence will share what they want you to know. This continues to this very day, whether we look into social media, news, different outlets of information. Though you may not know, Lister had a major impact of the interpretation of Chinese martial arts, and we discussed that all through Kung Fu Podcast 213. As always, Professor Ben Junkins, who has from day one been a great supporter of the program, describes that Lister took pride in creating a meaningful translation for his readers in Europe. So he would transform his stories through various techniques. However, his perspective and bias of Chinese culture was blended into this translation. So we're going to go back into a short news item from the early summer of 1872. It is the account of an actual challenge match and its social fallout. These sort of items are rare finds for any kind of academic researcher. This news account was published for the English public later in the summer, July 13th actually of the same year, 1872. The martial arts are once again associated with the economic marketplaces and the types of ruffians one might find there. This is an important clue to understand the history of the Chinese combat systems to contemplate. Setting martial arts in a historical marketplace is portrayed today in so many movies, shows, and theaters. Take, for example, the TV series Into the Badlands. There are number of scenes that are put around marketplaces. Professor Junkins states, with that being said, students of martial arts studies think carefully about their link, methodological, and theoretical assumptions. The hand combat systems are referred to as arts precisely because they exist only as social institutions. They differ from pure violence in that these techniques exist within a framework of ideas and identities which are meant to be conveyed from teacher to student. Questions of community involvement are necessary to the development of the martial arts. Modern sociologists and anthropologists note a strong link between many hand combat traditions and social marginality in a wide range of cultures and settings. This is precisely why historians interested in questions of social history and popular culture must take note of the Chinese martial arts. As in most places, the history of China was written by educated elites. That would make the day-to-day realities of most people's lives very difficult to reconstruct. The Chinese martial arts are interesting in that they offer a unique window into the hopes and concerns of a large segment of the population that might otherwise just be overlooked. Furthermore, the lineage-based nature of these fighting systems means that modern organizations and practices continue to look to the past for their legitimacy. These fighting systems often have sometimes preserved information, usually stories, but in other cases actual documents that historians will find very useful. More importantly, members of the local community tend to regard martial arts traditions as being ancient and the guardians of certain types of values. While most of the current Asian fighting systems that people practice are very much products of the modern era, they are nevertheless closely tied to critical discourses about identity, community violence, and history. This is why we explore the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts that sometimes includes history. It is not that these stories and practices, as they come to exist in the 1920s and 30s, actually represent China's ancient past. Rather, these stories represent an alternate view of the future, a future in which the state would serve the interest of a diverse and robust society, as compared to a future of a highly centralized state governing an artificially homogenized society. A close examination of any of the Asian martial arts will show that these things never existed in a vacuum, nor have the martial arts been motivated by a timeless and inscrutable morality uniquely their own. This story, published under the title Chinese Boxing in the summer of 1872, also revolves around a life-defining challenge fight. This event took place in a natural, mundane environment, totally lacking in the mist-covered temples. If there is one particular, rather than another, in which we might at least expect to find John Chinaman resemble John Bull, it is in the practice of boxing. The meek celestial does get aroused occasionally, but he usually declines a hand-to-hand encounter, unless impelled by the courage of despair. He is generally credited with a keen appreciation of the advantages of running away, as compared with the treat of standing up to be knocked down, and is slow to claim the high privilege the ancients thought worthy to be allowed only to free men, which was of being beaten to the consistency of a jelly. How the race must rise in the estimation of foreigners. Therefore, when we mention that the noble art of self-defense and legitimate aggressiveness flourished in China centuries probably before the fancy ever formed a ring in that Britain, which has become to be regarded as the home of boxing. Of course, like everything else in China, the science has rather deteriorated than improved. Its practice is rough, its laws unsystemized, its professors of the art, called fist teachers, offer their services to initiate their countrymen in the use of their mollies, and in addition in throwing out their feet in a dexterous manner. Boxing clubs are kept in country villages where pugilists meet and contest the honors of the ring. We are not unused to hearing of fatal encounters in the Western ring, where the brutal sport is hedged about with restrictions intended to guard against its most serious eventuality. But in China, homicide in such affairs is made more frequent by the admission of kicking. A case of the sort has just occurred at Taichung, a village about 8 miles due north from the stone bridge over the Suqiao Creek. In a tea shop where gamblers and boxers went to meet. Sounds like a modern-day affair almost. A dispute arose between two men about $18 cash, and it was arranged to settle it by fight. After a few rounds, one man succeeded in knocking the other man over with a violent kick to the side. The man sprang to his feet, exclaiming, "Ah, that was well done," and as he advanced to meet his antagonist again, suddenly he fell back, dead. Consternation fell on those concerned in the matter, and every effort was made to evade a judicial inquiry. The relatives of the deceased, however, came forward to make the usual capital out of their misfortune. They seized the homicide, the one that killed the other, and they put him in chains and bound him for 2 days and for 2 nights to the body of the dead man, which had been removed to the upper part of the tea house. An arrangement for pecuniary salve to their lacerated feelings was made, by which the people in the neighborhood paid $150. The tea house keeper paid $100, and the dealer of the fatal blow paid $50. But gambling and fighting had drained the resources of the latter. He was an impoverished rowdy without a respectable connection in the world, except for the betrothal tie, by which the fate of a young lady was linked with his, before either had a will to consult or the wayward tendency of his character had appeared. Glad of an opportunity to break off the engagement, the young lady's friends came forward and offered to pay the sum if he would surrender all claims to his fiancée. The offer being accepted, the whole affair was settled, the sum of a Chinese boxing match being thus: one combatant killed, a tea house keeper was now ruined, a neighborhood heavenly fined, and a marriage engagement broken off. Probably such incidents occur very often, but if the parties can settle it among themselves, the magistrates, for their own sakes, are only too glad to have the matter hushed up. So let's take some summary assessments. Chinese martial arts and social violence more generally occurred in the villages that were dominated by strong clan structures. 2. Most villages of this side would contain between 1 and 3 surnames, being dominated by a few large clans. While Lister chose to not go into detail on this point, taking a male who has wronged your clan hostage and holding them until a hefty ransom was paid was not an uncommon way of settling inter-village disputes in the late Qing dynasty. In presenting an outsider's perspective of the fight in Tachang village, Lister held the world of the Chinese martial arts in low regard. Other portions of this full account demonstrates he does not think highly of the English sport of boxing either. One can wonder whether his criticisms of people who practice the Chinese martial arts should be read as a subtle jab at his Western readers who may well be fans of their own forms of boxing. Professor Junkin states that the air of disdain is quite accurate, as it reminds us that even in the volatile 1850s through 1900, most respectable individuals in China were not interested in the martial arts. They found the practice and the individuals who took them up to be socially marginal. However, once we control the questions of tone, Lister's outside perspective yields a number of interesting historical and ethnographic observations. I ask you to make a note of how this story, which is historically real in the summer of 1872, is either unheard of or forgotten, while other stories of legends, such as the Southern Shaolin Temple, live on. We want to remember that this was in no way a shining example of investigative journalism, even by the 1870 standards. Lister makes no effort to hide the fact that he is far from a neutral observer, nor does he include some very basic facts in his account, such as the names of the two fighters, or even the date on which these events took place. However, there is more than enough descriptive detail to lead any academic researcher to believe that it is basically credible. The way it was written suggests that the point of this article was a transparent attempt to convince people to imagine China in a very certain way, not to teach readers technical or sociological facts about Chinese boxing. It became an exercise in the construction of ethnic and national mythologies by other means. The residents of southern China in the Qing and Republic periods lived in an environment saturated with the entertainment-based visions of the martial arts. They came in the form of Cantonese operas, marketplace performers, professional storytellers, serialized newspaper stories, collectible cigarette cards, kung fu novels, and later radio dramas and films. It was through these routes that many residents of Guangdong and Hong Kong first developed an interest in the Chinese martial systems. Lister wanted to convey his interpretation from a cultural perspective to all of his Western European readers. How we decide to tell stories and how we decide to share information makes a difference, not just for those who are in front of you today, but in some cases, how that might live on in the future. So as we're sharing information with our students, our friends, and our family, try to take in context the history that surrounds it, the characters, the stories, and the legends. And I enjoy making the time to try to take all that into a pot and learn from it, see what I can extend myself into and make myself better. See if I can't see past the curtain sometimes in the stories. We talk about this quite a bit throughout the Library of Kung Fu podcast, where, for example, we have new characters who are self-acclaimed grandmasters, or we have lineages that have decided to pluck certain personalities totally out as if they never existed, or insert others as if they have been a distinguished role. It doesn't matter. We can take these stories sometimes and twist them to our own means, or to control those people who are in front of us. I ask you to always be aware of the stories that you're told, and like in this case, look at the history from which it was told. Alfred Lister did a lot of services for Chinese culture and for people like us today to try to understand how it was to live in southern China during the late 1800s. However, you have to look through his prism. He wasn't interested in martial arts. He was a translator of hobby. He liked to put things in a cultural perspective, much more so than perhaps an academic researcher would. I'm excited that Kung Fu Podcast is ready to roll into the upcoming year. Whether you're a longtime practitioner or just starting, before you start your practice today, ask yourself what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then try to make sure that that practice is set up for that achievement. Take care of yourself. This is T.W. Smith, and I will be talking with you again very soon.